Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the rise of urban centers. So between 1860 and 1920, or the period we call the Second Industrial Revolution, we're going to see that there will be cities in America that will continue to grow in size, become ever more densely populated. We'll also see new cities be formed out of this new industrial age. The picture on our screen here is a painting by a man named George Bellows, who was one of many artists during the first part of the 20th century who captured these images of a new landscape developing. This particular painting is called The Cliff Dwellers. And in the same way that one might find in a natural rock face a dense population of birds and other creatures, he was making a play on that idea and speaking about how human beings now had created their own landscapes. It's important to understand that urbanization is ultimately a result of migration. That could be internal migration, so people moving from other parts of the United States, more rural areas to urban areas, but it can also be what we've continued to see throughout the first part of the 19th century, which is this external migration or immigration into the United States. And really, a couple interesting phenomenons develop in the period that we're studying today. One, the rural population doubles in the 60-year period, but you'll notice that the urban population is going to become almost 9 times the size it was in 1860. And ultimately, by the end of the era, the urban population will be larger than the rural population. And we'll see all kinds of political and economic changes as a result. If we're just comparing over time, the 10 largest cities by 50-year increments, you can see that New York City has always been a city with a very large population. If our graph continued all the way over to 2020, New York City would still have the largest population, twice that of what is Los Angeles, the next biggest city. But you can notice over time patterns develop. In 1800, all of these cities were port cities, even ones like Philadelphia, which were located on the Delaware River. Ocean-going vessels could literally sail up and release their cargo and take on new stuffs to be transported elsewhere. By 1850, some of our cities have changed, and some of this is not just simply the advent of the steam engine as used with ships, but we're also going to see the beginnings of the locomotive era. You will also see some westward push, so cities like New Orleans and Cincinnati, both of which are on pretty large river systems, Cincinnati on the Ohio River and New Orleans and St. Louis on the Mississippi. By 1900, we're going to see a city like Chicago, which was simply just an outpost on Lake Michigan in the 1840s, by 1900 become the second largest city in the United States. And in part because it becomes a railroad hub starting in the 1850s, and then meatpacking and other industries, especially in terms of manufacturing, make their home in and around Chicago. So there's work, and ultimately people are coming for that employment. By the time we get to 1950, we're going to see that New York and Chicago have grown continuously in size, but we're also going to see some new cities appear. Detroit will come to be out of the automotive industry. Los Angeles will come to be out of not just simply the entertainment industry, but it's also has an extensive Pacific port. We will also see a phenomenon throughout sort of the World War II era, well into our present day, which is that of aerospace, with the advent of the transistor in the early 1950s, the beginning of computing. And that's why by 2000, we have cities like Houston and Phoenix, San Diego, Dallas, also the oil industry as well. And so, again, new cities being created out of new industries. Also, two phenomenon that made it possible to go southwest in terms of population growth. One is improved forms of irrigation that'll be developed in the first part of the 20th century, as well as the fact of the advent of air conditioning. So we've been looking at the frontier as this space westward, and today we're going to look at the frontier being the city itself. So one goes there because they see new opportunity in the same way people saw opportunity in the West in an earlier period of time. We're also going to see that in order to facilitate this urban growth, we have to reuse space, new architectural styles, particularly that of the skyscraper. And by skyscraper, that meant any building over 5 stories that had its upper stories accessible by elevator. So by today's standards, 5 or 6 stories is not particularly tall. Certainly for the 1860s and 1870s, it was. And by the beginning of the 20th century, we're seeing buildings 30 or more stories in height being built. A new form of energy that's going to be utilized by the late 1880s, early 1890s with electricity. You're also going to see that, especially in cities like New York and Chicago, this melting pot phenomenon. To a certain extent, you'll see it also on the West Coast and around San Francisco, where you're getting lots of different immigrant cultures, languages, foods, religions, and ultimately there is some confluence. Often, what we call American food today has its origins in the culinary traditions in this period of immigration. But obviously, people are looking at the city as a place where I go and I'm facing the challenges of the concrete jungle, as it was once called. But I can be successful again with this idea of rugged individualism. So the same character that was required to be successful in the West is still assumed it's needed for the city. The other thing that we're going to see is a rise in crime and corruption. The more densely populated, the more taxpayers, the more money for corrupt politicians and bureaucrats to utilize, but also, especially before the electric light becomes mainstream, crime is going to be very common, especially um, in the darker periods of the day. So there are ultimately 9 characteristics of this urbanization process and space that we'll see during the Gilded Age. Whenever you see the word mass, mass transit, mass media, understand that mass means essentially the collective, a larger portion of the population. It may be one that is no longer local, it could be one that's quite extensive by region or even the nation entirely. But we will see, particularly beginning with the steam engine and certainly then utilizing electricity, subways and elevated trains and trolleys become common forms of public transportation. And so no longer do I have to live adjacent or within a block of where I work. I could actually work on the other side of a city. I could actually live in an area that might be less expensive to live in and maybe more residential and move over to um, an area for whatever commerce work I do for the day. Mass media, the rise of newspapers and magazines, and creating really a collective narrative for large cities, entire states, again, regions, or the nation as a whole. We're also going to see that within the cities themselves, until we begin to see the period of what is known as the progressive era, at a time when we see government as an agency of good and the beginnings of municipal laws and regulations to try to improve quality of life, squalid living conditions were very common, especially for the working and poor classes that lived in cities. We're going to see a lot of ethnic neighborhoods develop, especially as the immigration becomes far more varied linguistically and religiously in the latter part of the 19th century, and the rise of political machines. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides from now. So if you see my pictures, the one on the right, this is New York City, circa about 1860. And you notice that sort of the tallest buildings you can see are 3 stories. Most of these buildings are clad in wood. Um, Again, very different from 20 years later, where again, now we can see the multi-storied buildings. This one's probably 5 or 6 stories. These electric lines, not just simply for the telegraph, but also probably also for some degree of electric light. But just in 20 years, you will see quite a change to the urban landscape, especially with the utilization of Bessemer steel. Those multi-storied buildings required a strong yet much lighter infrastructure in order to make it possible. And so you begin to see the steel skeleton versus brick or stone walls and structures. Mass politics. So being able to get large numbers of people, literally tens of thousands, if not potentially hundreds of thousands of people, to be politically active and to help one political party prevail over another. Political machines will become part and parcel to all the major cities, in particular the ones on the eastern portion, the older, more established cities. New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia. Um, Philadelphia will have a Republican machine. New York will have a Democratic machine. Both parties will be able to control usually the larger influx of newcomers, whether that's Americans moving in from rural areas or helping immigrants in the process of settlement and eventually citizenship to guarantee their vote. Prior to the beginning of the 20th century, most tax monies went directly to a city council. And so local governments potentially had more and more money to spend year after year. In some cases, they did use that money to build city streets and parks and other things that would benefit the public. But often the other cost was what they took for themselves. And the king of the political machines, and certainly in terms of enriching himself, was William Boss Tweed. He will go on to be probably the most infamous because by the time he is arrested, tried, and put in prison, he will have absconded with about $50 million. By 1870, the equivalent to about $500 million today. The image all the way on the right is one of many that was drawn by Thomas Nast, who we've studied a little bit earlier when we were looking at Reconstruction. He often criticized what he saw as political corruption that ultimately hurt the people who were his supporters. And many of those people could not read or did not read English well. And so Nast was the perfect critic because he could tell a story in pictures that often an audience that would not be able to understand that criticism in text. Boss Tweed and many like him will be very successful because of the immigrant population. There were no social services. And so if you came to a place like New York City, you might have the name of a family member who had come before you. You might actually have written to someone and managed to secure some kind of employment for yourself or just come with a little bit of a nest egg. But the vast majority of people who came through Ellis Island, which was the embarkation center built in the 1890s and will continue to be used until the early 1950s. At one point, it was receiving more than 3 million people a year. A very cursory medical examination that took less than about a minute. They checked your eyes to make sure you didn't have trachoma, which was a disease that caused blindness. They made sure they listened to your heart and lungs to determine whether or not you had tuberculosis or some other pulmonary issue. They also made sure you had working hands and feet. But beyond that, there was really nothing to exclude people. And most of the shipping companies understood that if they were going to bring sick or potential workers who could not actually do work, they would be responsible and incur the cost of taking those people back to their port of origin. And so the shipping companies did their own examinations for most of these people before they arrived in the United States. But you can see this is just a single ship All these steerage class passengers who are immigrants have come to the top as they've entered New York Harbor, probably to see the Statue of Liberty, and the next place they'll go to in their journey in terms of coming to the United States. Early on, immigration was typically Irish and German, as you know. Those numbers will continue to grow and change in the period between about 1890 and 1910. You're going to see that Irish immigration, which was still a pretty big, large number in the early 1890s, will be dwarfed by Russian immigration from Italy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as we go into the turn of the 20th century. So the problems that came from rapid urbanization, including issues with sanitation, inadequate housing, homelessness for children, these will begin to be addressed in the last decade of the 19th century, and through different kinds of reformers, one being a man named Jacob Reiss. And although he was an immigrant himself from Holland, he was from an upper middle class family, college educated, and he had an interest in demonstrating to people, ultimately, as the title of his book claimed, how the other half lives. He was always interested to find that people who were of his same class, or perhaps even the most affluent people in New York City, were unaware that 30 blocks southward, you had people living in conditions like the ones you see on the screen. And so he was an amateur photographer. He combined his interest with that skill. And then with the new form of printing known as lithography, he was able to produce a book of photographs supplemented by some commentary. But he wanted to deal with ultimately lack of sanitation and running water. This group of apartments, this area had, this city block had no indoor plumbing. People were using outhouses, nearly 5,000 people living in a city block, all using the same common well. Certainly in the summer months, typhoid and cholera ran rampant, and other diseases as well. You obviously 5,000 people in an area that was probably built for no more than about 1,000 people. You had certainly overpopulation. Also, there were no regulations. You could rent someone a windowless basement as a domicile. Prior to the beginnings of the 20th century, there were no laws about abandoning children. So, homelessness for young children, as you can see in the image on the lower part of my screen, was unfortunately incredibly common. He also pointed out this in terms of public services, or those that were created by private institutions like churches. The same city block that he features here with these apartments had a synagogue and two churches, but more than 100 facilities that sold alcohol. They were called saloons in those days. We would call them bars today. But he said, to expect people to have the services they need and a culture that encourages hard work and thrift and sobriety, which we know were values of the day, these neighborhoods did not facilitate those things. Also, he noticed that recent immigrants were often the people who were most likely to be exploited in these conditions. His book, by today's standards, probably seems certainly stereotypical, if not racist. He organized his pictures by ethnic group, and at times sort of heightened certain stereotypes. By the 1890s, we begin to see a large population of Jewish people from Eastern Europe and Russia who had left. Their push factor was pogroms. There was all kinds of ethnic cleansing going on. And they came to the United States. They were people who typically had a kosher diet. Many of them did not read and write in Russian or the language of the nation they came from, but Yiddish. And their dress was quite different in terms of how they covered their heads and their interactions with the other people. And by today's standards, again, we would see that he perhaps was demonstrating a lack of efficacy on their own part. that was because they lacked the education and understanding of the culture. And there's a whole movement that comes out of Jacob Reiss, not just in terms of municipal reform, so writing laws that will help protect these people, but also this goal of assimilation. Certainly, public schools were beginning that process in this time, but you will begin to see something called the social gospel movement, settlement houses, which were created to ultimately help immigrants in terms of acquiring language and learning the customs and the norms of American life. One of the improvements that came out of Jacob Riis's activism will be the creation of a new architectural plan to be utilized for low-cost housing, something called the Dumbbell tenement plan. And you can see it really does look like a dumbbell, narrow in the center and wider on the ends. Each floor typically would hold 4 apartments. This apartment where you see 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a parlor. By living room, it would be more like your kitchen slash dining area today. Um, Sometimes with running water, but more often with not. Most likely just simply a stove for cooking, and water would be brought in from the hallway, from the water closet or a common sink and bath area. With 2 bedrooms and a parlor, it would be quite common for a family of 7 or more people to live in this space. You would have mom and dad and the youngest children in one bedroom, probably the daughters of the family in another, and then the boys in the family would, sleep on the couch, pull out additional mattresses, and sleep on the floor each night. This again still was seen as an improvement because people had fire escapes. They had access to air and light. That might be an air shaft that those windows lead onto, but it still was an improvement on terms of how people lived before. The outer structure of these, you can see this picture was taken in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But this was pretty common. You still see some of these. They will have been renovated inside because now apartments by law have to have their own independent bathrooms and kitchens. Um, but ultimately, the structure, the stairwells, those kinds of things, certainly one room leading onto another, that has not changed over time. And the last thing we're going to talk about is something called the City Beautiful movement. As the cities were growing, it was pretty typical for either land further out to be annexed and become part of the city, and people could build where they chose. Today, we have all kinds of zoning laws where there's certain kinds of commercial structures, there's areas for schools and other public facilities, certainly housing. And that all comes out of something called the City Beautiful movement. Daniel Burnham was an architect working almost exclusively in Chicago and New York in the late 19th century. And he believed that you had to have some planning, that you ultimately needed to encourage that there be spaces for just residences, that you needed to have spaces that could be what we would call mixed use today, where there might be on a first floor commercial buildings, for, the grocer and other businesses, but then perhaps apartments above. Public parks. He said if people are going to live without their own green space, we need to have a green space for all. This picture on the right-hand side, this is Central Park in New York City that began being built in the mid-1860s. And this area was all swampland. So the lakes you see in here today, the ponds, those are man-made. Actually, every rock, the roads that were built to connect one part of the city to another. There's a zoo inside of it, a public skating rink. Midway on the far east side also is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is a public art museum, essentially free to the people of New York, just a donation to be able to see these great works. But again, these were things to help elevate everyone who lived within the city. rich or poor. The center picture is of Washington, D.C., which you know of as the mall today. Again, built starting after the Civil War. At the far end, you can see the Capitol building. But basically, from what is the Washington Monument today, all the way, the reflecting pool, and then what is um, the Lincoln Memorial, all of that was planned out over a 50-year period, again, to engage the public to come and enjoy essentially a little bit of the country and the city. And then my far picture here on the left-hand side, this is a picture that was taken in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair, or what was known as the Columbian Exposition. Daniel Burnham was not just an architect, he was also a landscape architect. And in designing the fairgrounds, these two buildings here and the bridge, they remained. The buildings became museums after the fair closed, but the rest of the fairgrounds became a park. The buildings were only temporary, they were taken down, grass and other trees were planted. And again, even to this day in Chicago, it functions as one of the largest green spaces in the city. So as we end, we want to make sure that we understand the role that external and internal migration within the United States played in the growth of cities between 1860 and 1920. And then also that we understand the challenges that were created by increasing urbanization so rapidly. We want to know those because as we get towards the end of Unit 6, we're going to be looking at something called the Progressive Era, and ultimately the period between 1890 and 1920, where many of these challenges of urbanization will be resolved.